it was fascinating to see Anne grappling with the issue of truth, because truth means so many different things to different people, and of course it's almost impossible to verify despite what science tells us about it. And as a scientist, I'm particularly dismayed at the misuse of the term truth. For example, there are people like Ed Zardone who publish whole books called Trick or Treatment, which deals with the truth about different alternative health modalities. And of course, he's not talking about the truth, he's talking about his specific perspective, looking at each of these forms of alternative medicine in the way that he looks at it, which is via a reductionist scientific barometer that clearly does not work because it does not reflect individual people's experience. That is their truth. So taking this idea of truth into a domain where you kind of go away from the evidence-based medicine concept and you look at what people's realities are, what their experience of effectiveness is, how they have been working their way through cancers without using chemotherapy or radiotherapy, is extremely interesting. My view is, if you are a good scientist, you would be saying, isn't that interesting? Let's try and understand how many people are doing it, how it works, what we're getting wrong about orthodox medicine. Yeah, I run an international campaign called the Alliance for Natural Health, and we are very much looking at the challenges posed by the establishment, if you like, in building either a particular perspective on alternative and natural medicine, as well as trying to set this extraordinary noose around the neck of it to try and kill it off. And I'm an ecologist by background. I've got 3 science degrees. I am dismayed at the way in which reductionist science has been manipulated to create a healthcare system in the West that clearly doesn't work. We see ancient forms of healthcare that incorporate spirit, mind, body approaches that are very much whole body centered, particularly in the East, in India through Ayurveda, or in China through traditional Chinese medicine, that are now massively under threat by a regulatory system that is, at one level, a knee-jerk reaction to very, very few cases of harm that have been demonstrated, usually in the hands of incompetent people, including medical doctors, such as is the case in Belgium in 1998, where doctors in a slimming clinic prescribed the wrong herbs and delivered high levels of aristolochia that created harm and even death. But that was misuse of herbs. Now, if we were to use the same system on orthodox medicine, where countless pharmaceutical drugs have been shown to cause extraordinary problems, from acute death through to cancer, through to suicide, we would have to ban them tomorrow. And of course, one of the difficulties is we see this extraordinarily disproportionate approach between attitudes towards natural products compared with new to nature synthetic products produced by the pharmaceutical industry. We're trying to create more of a level playing field to try and create a framework, a legal and scientific framework that actually works. Orthodox medicine today is running very quickly towards a brick wall. It isn't working particularly well, particularly in areas of chronic diseases that are now the primary burden on healthcare system. So that includes cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, osteoporosis. The World Health Organization tells us that something like 65% of the world's burden on the healthcare system is caused by these diseases. Not one of them has a magic silver bullet solution produced by orthodox medicine. If we look to more complex, whole body centered approaches to healthcare that incorporate dietary lifestyle regimes together with nutrition, together with the use of plant nutrients, whole foods, and other so-called alternative medicine modalities, there are remarkable stories, and many, many thousands of them, of recovery. And one of the reasons that despite all the very much planned negative headlines about the harm and the danger and the lack of effectiveness of alternative medicine approaches, one of the reasons that people don't shy away from these approaches is because they have personal experience of their extraordinary effect. What we lack are scientific methods that adequately document both what is happening and why it's happening. Within the Alliance for Natural Health, as an international campaign, particularly focused in Europe and the United States, that's what we're doing. We're bringing together key players in this area. We are working to if you like, positively shape these legal and scientific frameworks. We're involved in a series of legal actions currently against the US Food and Drug Administration. We're co-plaintiffs in 3 cases. We've just had the results of one of them against the FDA, where the FDA were trying to remove the ability of US companies to mention cancer risk reduction in relation to products containing selenium. And essentially we've been able to take that case to a district court, and through the work of Jonathan E. Maud, the case has been successful, and it appears that the FDA are not going to be responding to it. We're also working in Europe on a case to bring together both Indian and Chinese medicine interests to challenge the European law that, as of the 1st of April 2011, seeks to make it almost impossible to put classical herbal medicines from these great traditions on the market. Many of them have been selling as food supplements now for decades in Europe, with probably well over 1 million people using them, and yet as of 1st of April 2011, arbitrarily they will be banned because it is impossible to get these medicines to pass through the regulatory requirements that are again quite arbitrary in order to have them licensed. We're seeing a whole range of regulatory approaches. It's very much out of the boil the frog slowly mold that are creeping in over a period of years. And roundabout by 2012, 2013, we'll see the most severe impacts of these pieces of legislation. And it is imperative that people understand what they are, what can be done, how you can, if you like, find workarounds to not have to see immediate bans or stop using these products yourself, or if you're a supplier or retailer, how you can actually live with the regulation, but most importantly, how we can come together to challenge these in the court and change them, because they're unfair, they're disproportionate, they are discriminatory.
Well, this sounds quite catastrophic. Does this actually mean that traditional Chinese medicine in the normal herbal form will no longer be available to the UK public after April the 1st?
That's certainly the case as it stands at the moment. There's been 7 years in which companies have been able to apply for licenses under the traditional herbal products licensing scheme developed in Europe. It's a centralized registration system, and so far not a single Chinese herb or Indian herbal product has actually successfully gone through the licensing system. Next week we go to Belgium to meet with a lot of European players that are equally distressed by the situation. There are European lawyers already working at trying to create, if you like, a fix for it. The positive outcome of all of this is that most of the key players understand the problem and are coming together to try and deliver a solution, and we're very much engaged with that solution.
But we've heard examples in the mainstream media of how officials in the World Health Organization who were responsible for declaring the swine flu pandemic were in receipt of financial remuneration from the same pharmaceutical corporations that were responsible for producing and selling these vaccinations. So There are many examples of the collusion between Big Pharma and the World Health Organization. Do you think this is yet another example of that?
I think it's very clear that large corporations are steering the majority of this legislation, and they're steering it often in cahoots with governments and other global authorities such as the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization in the UN. Saying that, what we've got to recognize is that if you look at the individuals within these organizations, you can actually find individuals who understand the problem, who are disillusioned with the organizations that they work within. And I think it is imperative that we don't feel disempowered by actually the relatively few people in the world that are creating so much drama with respect to regulation or negative publicity or particular scientific studies that show negative results that have been manipulated in that direction to give those results. We need to actually try and find better systems of communicating with one another. I'm always rather amused at the concept of conspiracy theory in the area of natural health care, because there is actually no real theory. If you look at the facts are clear as day, whether you're looking at the manipulation in the field of genetically modified organisms, which is a huge threat to our health, or if you look at the pressure on trying to regulate out of existence natural medicines.
So thank you, Robert. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more detail specifically about the campaigns that the Alliance is running and real ways in which people can actually get involved and make a difference.
We're running 10 different campaigns at the moment in different fields of natural health, and if you look at all of them together, they really encompass all the areas that we can both experience the greatest benefits by, if you like, reassociating with nature, as well as us needing to be very aware that if we get it wrong, we end up being exposed to or consuming things that are actually very harmful. So if we look at foods, for example, we know that food and lifestyle, if you like, is not only the biggest potential killer and the biggest potential contributor to the chronic diseases that we suffer from so badly, it is also part of the solution. And bet your bottom dollar that your local GP, your general practitioner, has not been trained in how to use diet and lifestyle to help you. So this is where this concept of individual responsibility, personal responsibility, as well as people working more in their local communities to source their foods, going to the local farm shop, going to the growers market, opting out of the system at your local supermarket that relies on the global trade of foods that are often processed, they're often treated in certain ways to knock back the enzyme activity so that they can actually travel from one side of the world to another. They may be irradiated, they are often full of preservatives, to going back to consuming whole foods that are bought locally. So we can transition out of this global food supply system into a local food supply system. We can introduce that into schools, into our families. We can encourage our kids not to be eating processed foods. If you look at surveys of young people's diets in the UK, for example, it is of deep concern where things like savoury snacks and white bread are the most important food groups that these children are eating. If you look back at the chronic disease stats of today for our generation that on the whole ate a slightly healthier, more whole food diet, it is like a time bomb waiting to happen. So we need to take responsibility to ensure that children who are the first to embrace wholesome, natural ways of living, but they won't do that unless they have the support system around them that allows them to do that. So we have our Food for Health campaign that deals very much with this issue. There's a lot of guidance on approaches that you can take that can really transform people's lives. If you look at the issue of genetically modified foods, Europe is in a very, very sticky situation at the moment where consumers have provided the greatest resistance to the mass cultivation of GM crops. If we look in the United States, for example, where that resistance hasn't happened, we see a situation where over 70% of foods sold in US supermarkets now contain GM foods. And genetic modification, there is so much misinformation that is given about it. Two key pieces are that, well, you shouldn't really worry about it. They've only got minor traits such as herbicide resistance or insect resistance. But of course, the very process of introducing genetic cassettes, often from alien species into another species, does something that nature has never done before. Many of you will have heard of the concept of genetic junk, that is the 97+ percent of our DNA that supposedly does nothing. And of course, what science is now beginning to show us is that all of that non-expressing area of the DNA actually has genetic material that contains silent genes, that has actually functional components. It may, to come from more of the metaphysical side, it may contain our entire Akashic record. Coming from a more Western reductionist biological viewpoint, it almost certainly contains our entire evolutionary history. So you start chopping that about. It's one of the reasons that we start to see problems developing if we look at the laboratory research, the animal studies that are being conducted. And we're starting to see this trend where people and animals that consume a lot of genetically modified foods start to suffer from precisely the sort of effects that we would expect from those that are exposed to foreign proteins. Now, what do genes express? They express proteins. So if they are now starting to express different proteins and alien proteins, we would tend to see inflammatory disorders. And what is the condition that ties the big 5 chronic diseases together? It is inflammation. You can read reports that scientists that are studying allergies, for example, in our society are saying, we have no explanation for this massive increase in allergic reactions that people are suffering from, and children in particular. It is not a great surprise if you also track the increase in the amount of genetically modified food that is people are being exposed to. So we have our Say No to GM campaign that is designed to give people who are already consuming natural foods a much better understanding of what the real problems are with genetically modified foods and why it is so critical that we maintain the pressure on our governments to prevent the cultivation of GM food. Another big lie that we are often told about GM is that we need GM foods to resolve the poverty problems that are occurring in developing countries, such as Africa. Now, we only have to look at the UN-sponsored study, the ISTAT study, that took scientists, 400 scientists from 60 countries, and over a 5-year period, looked at the role that genetically modified food could play in relation to climate change at alleviating poverty. And the consensus of the study, when it was published in April 2008, and of course 6 months before that, the biotech companies that had been involved all ran out in disgust and had no further involvement with it. What the consensus was that genetically modified food has no role to play in poverty alleviation. Having said that, there are still world leaders going around saying we need GM to resolve poverty problems. The reason for this is this extraordinary tie-up, business tie-up between governments and biotech corporations. And it is the very worst thing you could do is allow smallholder farmers that are producing food for subsistence to be reliant on the seeds from half a dozen companies. And that's what biotech is about. It's about dominating the supply of seed. And if we look at what companies like Monsanto are doing, not only are they dominating the GM market, they're also increasingly becoming major suppliers to the organic trade. So we see this distortion of wholesome, natural, organic farming relying on seed stock that is a result of natural systems of plant breeding that haven't been subject to the pressures that the last 50 years of plant breeding has brought us, where cosmetics, lower enzyme contents of food can be transported, low nutritional content, low pest and disease resistance have been pretty much bred out of. So please have a look at our Say No to GM campaign. We're also very concerned about the quality of drinking water. Many of you will know that the water in most metropolitan areas passes through the human body many times before we drink it. In order to reduce the risk of microbiological infection, water is obviously treated with chlorine. Chlorine, if we consume the water fresh from the tap, and we see water authorities all the time telling us to do this, has major risks associated with it. And it's not just what we drink, it's also the water that we shower in and the water that we take baths in. It has actually been a study that's come out of Imperial College that suggests that showering in chlorinated water increases your cancer risk 3 or 4 fold. There's a lot we can do to reduce our exposure to chlorine. One of them is to boil the water. One of them is to leave the water standing in a jug to open air so the chlorine comes off. What it doesn't do is remove the chlorination byproducts that are formed in that water. There is also, in countries like the UK and particularly in Ireland, a big pressure to continue the fluoridation of the water supply. Fluoridation of the water supply is one of the most unscientific systems you can imagine when you really look at the evidence. The benefits are very questionable. They're dependent on administration of very specific dosages which cannot be achieved when you just put this medicine into the drinking water supply. And they also require exposure to very specific ages of children at a particular time. The risks are very great, and everything from thyroid and hormonal imbalance to effects on the pineal gland that occur from long-term exposure that may contribute to increased rates of cancer, increased rates of bone fracture and osteoporosis are huge. If people want to use fluoride for dental purposes, the option is open to them to use it topically in the mouth, but the idea of introducing it into our drinking water and mass medicating the population is utter madness, and there's almost no science that stands up to this. We're working with players in the fluoridation area all over Europe and in fact all over the world, and we've recently seen that there is a shift within European agencies who are starting to recognize that there is a risk in particular to young children if we maintain fluoridation. So we must work to see the ban of mass drinking water fluoridation.
So thank you, Robert. Could you explain a little bit more about Codex, what it actually is, and also give us some detail about the restrictions to our herbal supply that looks imminent, please?
Yes, I mean, Codex is a misunderstood concept by many who know about it, and it's not understood or even known about by the majority. And it is basically a system of guidelines, standards and recommendations that was established initially back in 1962-63 by the United Nations through the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. And basically it's become a system that controls the global food supply. So if you look at the kind of foods you get in supermarkets these days, that has generally conformed with the rules that have been set up by Codex. If you start complaining to your local member of parliament or member of the European Parliament, or in the US to your elected representative, and say, look, I've got a problem with Codex, I've heard it's really bad, they will almost certainly come back and say, what are you worrying about? They're only guidelines, they're only standards, they're not laws, they cannot be enforced mandatorily. And basically, don't worry about it. The bottom line is that they act as a blueprint for laws. Now, why should countries be forced or encouraged to make their laws run alongside those that are set in Codex? Well, the reason for it is actually there is, if you look at the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement that is controlled and policed by the World Trade Organization, there is an article within that that says that you must do it if you don't want to fall foul of the big policeman of Codex, the WTO. And the bottom line is, if you're a small country and you don't like the rules that are being established that require you to include particular preservatives or pesticides or treatments to your food before you ship it across the world, then you can really start falling foul of the system. And there have been some major cases where, and in fact, all of it is in the public domain on the WTO website, where you can actually see what happens when major countries start ganging up on other countries in order to enforce particular rules. It's all done under the basis of harmonization, of trying to remove barriers to trade while also protecting consumers. But of course, that is a double-edged sword, and what we're seeing by and large is the development through these rules of the trade of very low quality foods that, okay, may not be riddled with bugs and microorganisms that transfer foodborne diseases, but they also are certainly not healthy foods, and they're certainly not going to reduce your risk of the major chronic diseases. So we need to really instill a much greater awareness of Codex so people can understand it, but they also need to know when particular laws are being implemented in the country in which they live that are modeled on Codex. And in the area of natural health, we're now seeing 2 guidelines within Codex that are actually modeled on very bad European laws. One of them is the Food Supplements Directive that has its absolute cousin sitting there as the vitamin and mineral guideline in Codex. The other one is the Codex guidelines on health claims, particularly the requirements for scientific substantiation, which are identical to those in the nutrition and health claims regulation, that represents probably the single biggest infringement on our freedom of speech. One of the reasons why many Europeans don't know about it yet is because it is still ticking along in its transition phase. Once the European Food Safety Authority has finished evaluating some 4,500 health claims that have already been docked down from the 44,000 that were originally going to be evaluated, it will be fully implemented. And what that means is that anyone selling any product that attempts to make a claim for its benefit will not be able to make any claim unless that claim has been approved by the European Authority, the European Food Safety Authority. So effectively, all claims are banned unless they're specifically allowed. Now, if you imagine through the ages how information has been transferred from generation to generation, this has occurred because of our communication about the benefits of these foods. To suddenly have a law that prevents it, that uses a reductionist scientific tool that basically tells us that most of the botanicals, most of the plant-based ingredients that have been looked at by the European Food Safety Authority, they say we see no causal relationship because the studies we've looked at do not meet our criteria, then you won't be able to make the claim. So this is a huge problem, and this law that is yet to be fully implemented in Europe has already found its way into global guidelines, into Codex, so that it can precipitate into other parts of the world. That process must be stopped, and the only way it's going to be stopped is people understanding it. Please go and have a look at our Codex campaign pages on our website. Another area that has very significant global impact is the notion that European law that is being seen by many regulators around the world as the most important template for a legal framework for natural health care, are about to ban systems of healthcare that have been around for thousands of years, non-European herbal systems, plant-based systems of healthcare. One of the things I talked about in my talk today is how, if you look at our closest non-human relatives, the chimpanzees, or you look at our other great apes that are also closely related genetically to ourselves, there is an extraordinary association between these great apes and the use of an understanding of medicinal plants. They have used them. So, if you like, our own use of herbs for healthcare precedes even the development of our own species. And now, suddenly, after at least 4,000 years of recorded history of use in China and in India through Ayurveda, we see a system that says, do you know what? Unless you can put these herbal medicines through our particular system that we believe ensures conformity and safety of those products, then you can't sell them. So that's how the banning process occurs. They don't immediately go out and ban them. They say, this is the obstacle course that you need to negotiate. And if you can't negotiate it, I'm sorry, you can't sell your product. So 7 years into the passage of the European Traditional Herbal Medicinal Products Directive, not a single Chinese medicine or Indian classical medicine has actually been successfully licensed. The only way to deal with this, because it's a fundamentally bad law, is to change the law, to be able to show that it is discriminatory, it's in breach of European human rights, it is disproportionate, that it prefers, if you like, the German phytopharmaceutical tradition over classical medicine systems outside of Europe. And it is also very non-transparent. The scientific requirements that create all the problems for it actually refer straight back to the very same pharmaceuticals directive that Prozac is made under, that conventional new-to-nature synthetic pharmaceuticals are made under. So what's happened is that the regulators have adapted those outside of the strict regulatory framework and made them so tough it's almost impossible for natural substances to get through the door. So again, please look at our Nurture Herbal Medicinal Cultures campaign to understand this extremely important process of working to create a framework that prevents these bans.
So thank you, Robert. Yeah, maybe I'd like to just take a few minutes to share your thoughts on the bigger picture, you know, how Big Pharma is fitting in with the global situation, the banks, the government. What's actually going on for us?
Well, there is no doubt that the individual is being pushed into a particular situation where we are being told we have fewer and fewer choices. Our ability to take stock of our own circumstances, whether it's healthcare, whether it's economics, are being massively diminished. Some of this is an illusion. If you want to live in a community and be outside of the system, actually you can go quite a long way. You can grow your own plants, your own foods. You can barter products and services between each other. But of course, the vast majority of people are fed a particular way of life. It starts very young. It's fed through the media, it's fed through television programs that make them believe that they have to live a particular way, they have to eat particular sorts of foods, they have to get particular types of jobs to have respect in the society, they have to, they get more and more kudos as they accumulate financial wealth in the system, if they accumulate more properties, they do better still. And that system is problematic from so many respects. And it is most problematic from the perspective of allowing individuals to, if you like, self-actualize, to develop a true sense of themselves and where they're going, how to connect with who they are, why they are, and that they are part of the organic structure of this planet. So if you like, the dissociation from nature creates so many of the problems, be it cancer, heart disease, stress, financial worry, that occupy the minds of so many of us, particularly as we get older. That system is an orchestration of processes that have been developing for a very long time. If we look, for example, in the United States at the development of the Rockefeller Empire and the development of the oil industry that then spawned, if you like, the chemical industry, the agrochemical industry, and we look at the other side of the Atlantic into Europe at the Rothschild family that then spawned the pharmaceutical industry and parts of the chemical industry as well. These have come together to create this oil, pharmaceutical, biotechnological cartel system. That system is providing the impetus to the education system, the funding for grants, so that the scientific methodology that is now almost worshipped is a form of reductionist science that is dissociated from its natural origins. Yes, ecology is studied in universities. I myself studied ecology at university. But even if you are chasing your next research grant, you will find that if you can basically carry out a piece of research or propose a piece of research that's going to be in the interest of a corporation, you'll be signed up fairly quickly. If you're doing a piece of research that is counter to the interests of those corporations, you're really going to be struggling to get your research grants. And that is the name of the game. I've had a very direct experience of that. I had a series of back-to-back research programs while I was at Imperial College. The more that the projects worked against the system, if you like, the harder it was to get those findings published or to get the funders, the backers behind the research grants to actually publicize that research in other ways. You certainly wouldn't be seeing it in newspapers because on the whole it was harmful to the agrochemical companies and the big food producers in the agricultural area. So we really need now to, if you like, respond very fundamentally within ourselves, within communities, within families, in order to take stock of where we are, why we are, what has happened, why are we so dissociated from nature, why are so few people spending so little time within the natural environment, why are we so concerned about the CO2 situation and yet unconcerned by mass deforestation that's occurring in the Indonesian and Malaysian jungles, in West Africa, in South America. These are some of the biggest issues, most serious issues to biodiversity and even our fundamental survival. They are directly related, if you like, to the climate change issue, but they're probably even more important. So again, we see distortion of even campaign focuses as a result of the interests of major corporations. The individual has infinitely more power than he or she imagines. The power, our consumer power alone is extraordinary. If we stopped buying petrol from particular outlets and we all did it together, if we stopped buying foods from particular supermarkets and we all did it together, if we stopped queuing up in our GP surgeries because we no longer liked the type of healthcare service that GP was delivering, we could change things tomorrow. And the only way that's going to happen is for people having the awareness to be able to understand the importance of doing it and also to use the communication systems that are available to us so that we can all do these things together.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Would you care to talk a little bit about sustainability in health and evidentially based medicine and how that reflects with a media perspective?
Absolutely. Well, evidence is everything, and we've seen the development of this concept of evidence-based medicine. Bottom line is, whose evidence are you looking at? And evidence-based medicine was a concept developed in 1992 by Professor David Sackett and others. And what he originally proposed was that evidence-based medicine would be a system that would select the optimal healthcare modality based both on what was published in the peer-reviewed literature and also what was happening at a level of the clinic, so from clinical experience. 4 years after he published it, he was already complaining as an editorial in the British Medical Journal that, guys, you've railroaded the concept. First of all, you're not talking about generally what is published in the peer review. You're focusing almost exclusively on randomized controlled trials. And secondly, you've completely dropped consideration of what's happening at the clinical level. And one of the reasons you see this fundamental problem when you look at analyses of either conventional or alternative medicine just by randomized controlled trials, very specific trials that are conducted because they are theoretically, they have more statistical power. But the reality, because of the complex interactions that a patient experiences around a clinician, they have so many false assumptions associated with them that they create very variable results. So even if you look at, say, the 2,500 orthodox medical treatments that have been evaluated by orthodox scientists and that have been published in the journal Clinical Evidence, you'll find that actually only 13% of orthodox treatments have been found to be beneficial. If you look, for example, at the work of Professor Edzard Ernst, who's Professor of Complementary Medicine at Exeter University, who's been seen as one of the biggest critics of alternative medicine, we would say that Ernst publicizes negative views about alternative medicine primarily because he is inspired to do it. He exaggerates negative studies that are found and delights, probably because he's got a lot of friends in the pharmaceutical industry and other places who rather like what he does, and in organizations such as Sense About Science. And that message is amplified massively through the media. The reality is that if you look at his own data, and it's interesting that he himself published this year, 2010, in the journal Pulse Today, and he said, look, I'm rather fed up with people criticizing me for always saying negative things about alternative medicine. I've analyzed my own studies, and I've found that 53% of his own studies that are publicly viewed as being very negative are actually positive. So that 53%, it could be said, compares against only 13% when you look at orthodox medicine. So we have to understand that the tools of evidence-based medicine have been deeply distorted. We have moved to this very reductionist approach that's very much based on randomized controlled trials that takes us away from the world of observational evidence. We've now learnt that anecdotal evidence is to be frowned upon. And yet if you look scientifically, anecdotal evidence is the very thing that's whetted the appetite of all major scientific developments. So if we look, say, at in the realm of alternative cancer care, why are conventional oncologists not going into this world and saying, my goodness, it seems that a whole bunch of people who've been labeled as having terminal cancer are now recovering. They're recovering when they start moving to whole food diets, where they manage their stress, where they take particular nutrients and phytonutrients and herbal products. What is it about these lifestyle changes that allows cancers to simply disappear from the body? but instead what we see is this massive attack against alternative medicine. It is really rather unscientific, I would say. If we look at the issue of sustainability, just how sustainable is the existing system? If you look at it from a point of view of both effectiveness and also cost, it cannot carry on. The burden on our governments to maintain systems that are largely pharmaceutical based is such that we need to see a change. And it's interesting, if we look at the for example, if we look at sustainability in other fields of human endeavor, whether we look at agriculture or energy or tourism or construction or forestry, they all relate to natural systems at trying to find some sort of balance. In the energy area, it's about trying to find energy from renewable resources such as wind, solar, tides, waves, etc. In agriculture, it's about finding natural balances within the agricultural system so that you have organic systems or biodynamic systems of agriculture. In the healthcare area, the term sustainability, until we started introducing it as of 2006, has not generally been used. And what we need to find is, if you like, almost a third way that says, let's stop the fight between orthodox and alternative medicine. To have that ongoing fight resolves nothing. It's a little like throwing rotten tomatoes at one another. And in fact, the result of that often is just to further entrench each of the positions. But if we find a third way that actually meets particular sustainability criteria and say, look guys, you can have a particular healthcare system as long as it meets criteria A to Z, and those criteria are based on ecological principles, because our bodies are just another ecological system that interacts with its environment. Our gastrointestinal tract is actually one of the ways in which we have the most intimate exposure with our natural environment, through the food that we eat. And so we start to look at our bodies again as an ecological system, and we use ecological principles. I'd go one step further and say we should actually be using ecological principles for the development of a new economy. It makes no sense to not value our natural resources such as air and water in the way that we do. That's what leads to pollution. It's what leads to our lack of valuation of our own bodies, and it allows people to eat junk food and put toxic water into their bodies or ingest fluoridated water. So if we move to ecological principles, we can start to say, right, if you meet those criteria, you can then be regarded as having a sustainable system. And one of the principles you find, and this is a process that we've already started, is that sustainable systems are intrinsically biologically compatible. They don't work by interfering with intrinsic metabolic processes in the body. They work with natural processes within the body. And so sustainable healthcare needs to be an expansion of, if you like, biocompatible systems that work with natural products, work with the wider environment within which we live, which includes your social community, your relationship with people, your spiritual development even. And that way we can have a system that is actually in balance. And it's fascinating that the more you look at this sort of approach, you realize just how sophisticated the Eastern systems of healthcare are, because they have for millennia have already understood those interactions.
So yeah, maybe I'd like to share your thoughts on global warming or global cooling, and a little bit about the media.
Well, there's no doubt that the media are able to influence the majority of people's views. So if you look at any poll that is taken on a particular issue, the most important factor that's going to be affecting people's views is what they've heard in the media. And if you put out a lot of misinformation or disinformation, or you omit certain pieces of information, people will develop a rather distorted view. And I believe that's exactly what we see in the realm of climate change. First of all, the climate change debate has been blown, in my view, out of all proportion, because we have to understand how much of it is human related and how much is natural. We also have to look at very carefully whose data are you looking at. And if you look at some of the most realistic data, what we see is that there is probably a long-term progression towards cooling rather than warming. If we look at the initiatives that people are working so hard to follow in the area of climate change, most of it is focused on trying to alter the emissions of human-made machines. And if you look at the best assessments of how much that can impact, it's probably only about 8 or 10% of the total carbon dioxide emissions anyway. So if you want to look at a resolution to even the carbon dioxide imbalance that is such a big focus at the moment, you would have to say the most important thing you could do is reforestation. And what we've seen is very large sectors of the environmental movement taken completely off base by these arguments. We've seen this already happen historically. If we look back a few years to the biofuels debate, we saw major environmental campaigns saying that biofuels was going to be a solution to the world. Those campaigns actually started promoting the massive destruction of, say, the Southeast Asian rainforest and the planting of oil palm, for example, when this is almost certainly absolutely the wrong thing to do. And of course, over time, many of those campaigns have changed their tune. And if you look at what environmentalists were doing some 20, 30 years ago, it was actually truer to the principles of ecology, where conservation, biodiversity was seen as really some of the most important things we could do and maintain. And we have to look for inspiration. Who is doing it the right way? And one of the people in the environmental field that I believe is setting a phenomenal model that we can learn from is Willy Smits. You can go to his website at www.willy, W-I-L-L-I-E, Smits, S-M-I-T-S.nl, and be linked to the various programs that he's involved in reforestation. It's also linked to developing habitats for orangutans that have been had their habitats destroyed through the deforestation schemes. And it goes even further, looking at how you can develop economic and social models within these newly reforested systems. One of the secrets to the work that Willy Smits is doing is when he looks at re-establishing rainforests in areas that would otherwise become deserts, he does it by introducing huge diversity. They cultivate up to 1,300 or so species that are then replanted in areas that have been deforested, and that is the secret. And that power of diversity is also what we see as being so beneficial within ourselves in terms of our own diets, and that's what we're so missing from modern industrialized technological life. It has become simplified to the point that it is actually killing us.